interesting was how you push back against some of the most alarmist and apocalyptic rhetoric by using the mainstream science, like the IPCC scientific reports. Can you tell us about how you don't necessarily dispute the science, but more the messaging around the science of climate?
Yeah, you said it exactly right. I defend IPCC science. I defend mainstream science in every instance, from the Malthusian scientists and activists, as well as from the alarmist journalists. And so the thumbnail of it is that climate change is real. It's something that we should deal with. It does create risks that should be addressed, but it's not the most serious environmental problem. It's certainly not our most serious problem that we face as human societies. Other problems, deforestation, species extinction, are best dealt with through more technologically advanced and intensified agriculture. And that the basic direction of travel of human societies since the Industrial Revolution is overwhelmingly positive, both for people and the natural environment. And so, to give one example that is an underappreciated signifier of progress, is that the amount of land that we use for meat production, what we call pasture land, has peaked in the year 2000 and declined about the area of the state of Alaska. That's huge, because one of the greatest threats to endangered species around the world, including in New Zealand and in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, comes from cattle ranching. And so the less land that you have to use to grow beef, the more endangered species we'll save. And if we continue that trend through intensified meat production, that means producing more beef on less land, we can have a very positive ecological future. And this is what I am so bothered by, and what motivated so much of Apocalypse Never, is that a positive environmental future is not only possible, it's likely, and we can accelerate the transition to it if we embrace technology and progress rather than shun it.
Yes. So free-range organic farms are not the best idea if you're talking about more cattle on less land?
Unfortunately, the kind of farms that to visit, travel to places like Napa or Tuscany or Provence, are not the kind of farms that are highly efficient, productive farms. And so in some ways we can choose. We can have a planet that looks a lot like the vineyards of beautiful vacation places and agriturismo, or we can choose some amount of habitat for wildlife. We'll end up doing a mixture of both, but I think people need to understand that this is one area where there is a direct environmental trade-off between how are we going to use the land. There's not a win-win. I mean, unless you like intensified agriculture, which I think hardly anybody is particularly enthusiastic about. Its only main advantage is that it leaves us more land for endangered species.
Sure. I want to go back to a point you made before about people resisting the message that we've made a great deal of progress. Now, this resistance to the idea of progress turns up over and over and over again. Steven Pinker had to deal with it when people reacted to his book Enlightenment Now. There was sort of this incredulity that things have gotten better since the Industrial Revolution, since trade and commerce have flourished. Why do you think there's such a deep-seated and entrenched skepticism that things like trade, innovation and technology have actually brought us a wonderful standard of living?
Well, it comes mostly from the left, as you know. It comes from a desire to play what psychologists sometimes call the rescuer role. The rescuer is a very powerful role. It's a heroic role, and the rescuer requires a victim. And it requires, and to be exaggerated as a rescuer, because you can be a charity worker, but it's certainly to more exaggerated, more narcissistic, more egocentric rescuer role in an affluent society where many of the big problems have been addressed, then I think that rescuer role has become more empowered and ambitious and aggressive. So the rescuer role, they needs to take over all of Portland, Oregon. It needs to dominate public spaces. And then once it gets control of those public spaces, it doesn't really know what to do. It doesn't have any vision for governing. So it's I ultimately conclude, a very nihilistic rescuer impulse that is unaware of itself as a religious movement, really, as a kind of move to gain purpose and meaning. And that ultimately, I think, is what drives the apocalyptic environmental movement and impulses.
Now, at one point in your book, you mentioned that you were once apocalyptic in your thinking, or were on, verging towards that line of thinking, and you stopped yourself because you realized it wasn't good for your mental health. Can you tell us a little bit more about that process that you went through?
Sure. By the way, it was only one sentence in the book. It's not but the book is not there's some of me in it. The book is, it's not a memoir, but sure. Certainly. I think what I say is I was most apocalyptic about climate change when I was most unhappy for reasons that didn't have anything to do with climate change. And I think that's common. I don't think I'm super unusual. I think we see that with Greta Thunberg. Unhappy adolescents seeking to gain purpose and meaning in their lives, which is a totally noble impulse, but it manifesting in a kind of extreme and kind of manic way. Obviously, asking people to panic, I think, is a kind of mania. And so, for me, I think there was both some depression and some, I don't want to say in a clinical sense, because I think that would diminish much more severe forms of anxiety and depression, certainly, than I felt. But nonetheless, I think periods of unhappiness, I would say, were also characterized by more extreme and apocalyptic views. And again, I don't think that's unusual. I think we see that in a lot of particularly left-wing political movements, which are, again, about people wanting to feel powerful as rescuers, maybe because it's a lot easier than dealing with the problems in their own life. And I think to some extent that was what was happening with me as well. Sure.
That makes a lot of sense, and it resonates with some of the essays that we've published at Quillette by people who have been radical Marxists, not radical environmentalists, but they say the exact same thing. When it comes to encouraging people to panic, I think you make a good point that it's unethical to encourage panic. But we have been living through a very tough year. We've, obviously we're living through the pandemic, and earlier this year, where I live, we had these massive bushfires, and in your state, you've had the extreme forest fires. And so we are having to encounter events which do make us panic. Now, your argument is that extreme weather isn't increasing. Can you summarize that argument for us?
Sure. There's really two separate categories that people need to keep in mind. One is natural disasters, which are strictly measured as deaths, mortality per 100,000 or whatever, and then also as property damage. Right. And that's natural disasters. And then there's extreme weather events, which is how big is the hurricane, how frequent is it, how intense is it, how much more water is there in flooding. And so what you can have is you can have increasing extreme weather events, which there's some evidence for, and have natural disasters getting better. And that's basically what's been going on. So deaths from natural disasters have declined over 90% in the last several decades, including over the last 100 years, but also again over the last 40 years.
And
very few people die.
How do they measure that? How do they come to that figure?
Strictly on, that's just deaths from natural disasters. So just on, we have pretty good, because it's deaths, the data's pretty good. In fact, it's some of the best data, certainly better than hurricane strength.
So it's just recorded deaths.
Even forest fire.
It's like recorded deaths at the census office or something like that. Is that the data?
Yeah, it's national governments.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's it's just consistent with the overall increases in life expectancy and overall resilience, and so you see, even as the population quadrupled, deaths from natural disasters declined 90%. Very few people die in cyclones and hurricanes anymore, and those were two of the biggest, and flooding.
Presumably,
and so
that's because is that because warning systems have improved and people just evacuate quicker?
That's the main one. Storm shelters as well, and better infrastructure.
Yeah.
But it is incredible, just the low cost of weather forecasting, and so you'd call it societal preparedness.
Yeah.
And then in terms of forest fires, here's what I want to say about forest fires. I've gotten it kind of really clear now. We've had a huge accumulation of wood fuel in forests in Australia and California because of poor forest management. We put out forest fires that were good when we should have let them burn the woody debris. And so you could have had these high intensity fires that we've had in California without climate change, and you can have climate change and not have these high intensity fires. And the reason we know that is because well-managed forests in California, and I presume in Australia, though I haven't checked, survived the fires. The high intensity fires went into the well-managed forests, and then they dropped to the ground and became low intensity fires. And so what I would say is that the accumulation of wood fuel in forests is a necessary and sufficient condition for the high intensity fires that we saw. Climate change is neither necessary nor sufficient for those fires.
It's not necessary nor sufficient, but it could be an aggravating factor. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think it is an aggregating factor. I'm resistant to putting it on the same level as wood fuel.
Sure.
Because it's.
An interesting thing about wood fuel is that in Australia, after our bushfires or during our bushfires, I was doing some reading about it, and there is actually a lot of people have resisted we call it back burning here. People resisted back burning because of the smoke, because of the air pollution. So on the one hand, there's this resistance to a management tactic that would control fires or help control fires because of pollution. But on the other hand, people are wanting to find an environmental, blame an environmental cause for the bushfires. So it's sort of ironic. I'm not sure if anything like that has occurred in California, where people actually resist controlling the forest because of the air pollution factor.
Yes, it's identical. It's exact. We are truly very, very similar in that regard. And so that has been a big factor. I think it's been changing some, but I mean, it's ironic because, before Europeans came, California was very smoky. We know this because when the Europeans came, they complained of how smoky it was. They didn't like it. And so I think we associate smoke with industrial pollution and degradation, and in reality, smoke is natural and necessary for our forest ecosystems. For most forests, actually, they need some amount of fire. So I've been reluctant because at first, when I was debunking some of this stuff, I would point out that we haven't had significant increases, over a long-term period in the area burned. But then I stopped saying that because it made it sound like I was saying that was a good thing.
Yeah.
When in some ways we need more fires, and so I didn't want to contribute to the demonization of fires. And so it's an issue that requires some of that nuance. And I think it's been another case of where the ignorance of the average person, the ignorant belief that fire is bad, has been
Yeah.
manipulated and led people to think that we're in a kind of hell. I mean, it's obviously a metaphor for apocalypse, and I think it's very manipulative.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, there were some green groups who actually opposed backburning before we had our massive bushfire season because of the pollution the smoke would cause. Now, one thing that really fascinated me about Apocalypse Never was the unholy alliance that you expose between people who have made a great deal of money through fossil fuels, who then invest in renewables, who then lobby to get nuclear plants shut down. Now that whole chapter on the governors in California who had oil money and who got nuclear plants shut down, that just blew my mind. Do you want to summarize what you reported in that chapter for people who don't have access to your book right now?
Sure. So the governor of California for 16 years, Jerry Brown, his father and the family had the oil concession from the Indonesian dictatorship from the 1960s on, and had always, and also they had natural gas assets, and they had always fought to shut down the nuclear plants, which would have directly replaced first petroleum and then natural gas. And people sometimes say to me, well, Michael, don't you think that Jerry Brown was genuinely anti-nuclear? And the answer is, of course, but the conquistadores, they were genuinely Catholic. They just wanted. So
Yeah.
I wanted to, in Apocalypse Never, treat each of these motivations as a true motivation. So
Yes.
it's financial, power, and religion are the three big motivations. But clearly, I mean, the financial conflicts of interest are. I mean, the entire renewables lobby is in basically an open public alliance right now with natural gas companies, including BP and Shell, actively building solar plants and working with Greenpeace to shut down nuclear plants. It's happening in Europe, it's happening in the United States, and I suspect that those relationships exist in Australia too, though I've never looked into them.
Sure. And one thing I learned through Apocalypse Never, which I had not heard about anywhere else, is that renewables, there's all sorts of problems with renewables, which we might go into, but one thing I wasn't aware of is that they also produce toxic waste. Because toxic waste is often the argument made against nuclear energy, but solar panels produce toxic waste as well, don't they?
Well, it's actually much more toxic than nuclear waste in the sense that nuclear waste is the only waste byproduct from energy production that is safely stored and that never hurts anybody. Whereas we know now that solar panels and batteries are being sent to poor communities in Africa in particular, that then use the solar panels for a few more years, the end of life, and then they can either get smashed up and used for the valuable materials within, which is mostly the copper wire. But then that exposes people to lead, which is used for the soldering of solar panels, and it becomes a toxic waste problem. In fact, as soon as the solar panels come off your house, and this is as true in Australia as it is in California, they become hazardous waste. And right now they're just set to go to the landfill, because usually when you take them down off of roofs, they break apart. And they really don't last long. I mean, I think people think they last a long time, but really most panels, we use them for just for just 20 years. And so nuclear plants can run for 80 years. So you're talking about somewhere between 200 to 300 times more waste from solar panels than from nuclear power production.
And the key difference between nuclear energy and renewable energy which you articulate in the book, is energy density. Now, that was a concept I did not have my head wrapped around before I read the book. And so why is energy density so important?
Energy density explains almost everything that you need to know about the impacts of energy on the environment. There's a related measure, which is power density. That's how much electricity per unit of land. And similarly, that explains agriculture. So what you want is, we want high power densities, because if you have higher energy density fuels, higher power density farms and factories and cities, you are using less natural resource. You're using less materials, you're mining less, you're using less land. And so this single concept, which is just a simple physical principle of, in the case of energy density, the fuel content, or in the case of power density, the electricity. So, to give you a sense of it, a glass of uranium, it's not liquid, but if it were solid uranium, that's enough for my entire high energy life, including all of my jet travel, which is a miracle. That's what the miracle of nuclear energy is.
Wow.
By contrast, you need literally 1 million times more coal to produce the same amount of electricity. Wow. You need 400 times more land to generate the same amount of electricity from a solar farm or a wind farm as from a nuclear power plant. Mm-hmm. So it really explains almost everything that you need to know about energy. It's such a powerful, and it's a physical concept. This is not invented by economists. This is a basic physical idea.
Yeah. And batteries don't really pick up the slack, do they?
Every time you use a battery, you are adding one energy transition, or one energy conversion, and then another energy conversion. So you're making the system much less efficient.
Okay.
And adding to the cost, and then adding much more material throughput. The costs of battery backup for the whole electrical grid are so prohibitive that basically we lose track at somewhere around 3 trillion.
Yeah. So there's been all of this effort, there's been all of this money and investment into renewables, but as you've pointed out in your writing, not just in Apocalypse Never, but in essays for Quillette and Forbes and elsewhere, you've pointed out they haven't really delivered on their promise because they are energy dilute. But why hasn't there been a pivot to nuclear? Is it just because of the fear of radiation, nuclear waste, or has there been more vested interests involved in preventing that pivot?
Yeah, there's really 3 different motivations for the opposition to nuclear. The first is financial. If you have nuclear, you don't need renewables and you don't need natural gas. You don't really, you can be like France.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's the end of the story. The second issue has to do with power. If you don't need renewables, or frankly, a lot of this energy efficiency stuff and batteries, it's just garbage. If you don't need those things, then you don't have political donations and political constituencies that matter. And then the third thing is that nuclear presents a spiritual challenge. I know that's a funny word to use, but the power that nuclear gives humans is unlike any power we've had. It is compared to fire, but the power of nuclear is obviously the power to create nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And that's just absolutely terrifying to many people. And nuclear weapons should be terrifying. That's how they work. That's what deterrence is.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard for people to decouple nuclear weapons from nuclear energy. And I think it raises some troubling questions for some people. It doesn't for me anymore, but it does for some people, about human power. They just view it as too much human power.
Do you think that once the baby boomers have all retired, because they grew up afraid of nukes because the Cold War was on, do you think once they've all retired and younger people come through who didn't grow up living under that blanket of fear, perhaps there will be increased acceptance and an embrace of nuclear technology?
Yeah, I said something like that to my mostly millennial staff. And then I think 2 weeks later, HBO announced the Chernobyl documentary horror series. So I joke sometimes, it seems like every generation wants to traumatize its children about nuclear. And I guess all I would say is I think that Chernobyl on HBO was less terrifying than the films that they made those of us in Generation X watch.
Yeah.
And I think the films that we had to watch were much less terrifying than the films that baby boomers had to watch. So what I would say is I suspect the fear of nuclear will continue to echo, but that the echo will be softer each time.
And going back to Chernobyl, it's quite remarkable when you actually look at the figures of how many people who have died from nuclear accidents. There aren't actually that many people, are there?
It's shocking. It really is. So about 50 firefighters killed the night of the accident and in the following months. And then the only cancers that resulted were thyroid cancers, where the mortality rate is 1%. It's very low. And so we think somewhere around 150 people have died or will die from thyroid cancer from Chernobyl. And anything beyond that uses a methodology that I think is discredited because it's called linear no threshold, which means that any amount of radiation causes damage. And we know that that's not true because I'm from the state of Colorado and we have some of the highest radiation in the United States and we have the longest lives. So the two are clearly not a causal relationship. So it is shocking. I mean, I think the most shocking thing is these events have such a power over us that is so beyond the death toll. And that's why I think you have to ask what else is going on, that it can't just be a rational consideration of the risks.
Do you think Jonathan Haidt's purity foundations from his purity foundations theory is playing a role? Because radiation is invisible, we can't see it, and so we're petrified of this invisible force that we can't control and we can't see, and that activates our fear of contamination.
Absolutely. 100%. And in fact, the way we know that is because nuclear energy was considered clean before it was considered bad. And then once it was considered immoral, which is around the late 60s, only then did nuclear energy become viewed as dirty. And so when people refer to nuclear as dirty, what they mean is that it's immoral. And then they make up word salad about nuclear waste and Simpsons videos. But nuclear energy is objectively the cleanest way to make electricity by far because of the energy density. And so the view of it as dirty is a way of saying it's immoral and impure.
Yeah. And to give us some perspective, are you aware of how many people die every year from breathing in fumes from burning wood, which powers a lot of developing countries?
The best estimates from the World Health Organization put that number at around 2 million lives shortened per year from breathing wood and dung smoke. And you remember, about 2 billion people use wood and dung on a regular basis. And then another 4 billion have their lives cut short from fossil fuels.
And a really important part of your book, which I haven't seen drawn out or even mentioned in sort of left-wing media, is how you champion the development in poorer nations, and how you advocate for them to develop on their own terms. And so you argue that it's not fair to expect poorer nations to leapfrog over from not using coal to straight into renewables. Can you explain that concept for those who haven't read your book?
Well, sure. I mean, most countries pass through similar transitions. So we start with wood and dung, and then we use hydroelectric dams, which are the most reliable and efficient form of renewable energy. And then we might use coal plants. And then we've transitioned gradually from coal to both petroleum and natural gas. And then eventually you reach the highest level, and that's France.
Yep, nuclear.
Yeah, and so I don't think renewable, I mean, so the one thing we all agree on, in fact, the economists everybody agrees with this, George Monbiot, which is that we could not have had the Industrial Revolution with renewables. They just didn't produce enough energy. So that's why I believe that people that are the real strong advocates of renewables are making an argument against industrial civilization, but in stealth fashion. And there's romanticism in it, that we're harmonizing with nature, but the romanticism is really around moving back towards a lower standard of living that we had under an agricultural economy.
But you point out that many of these advocates or champions of moving backwards in time actually live quite extravagant lifestyles themselves. What explains the massive lack of self-awareness of some of the most vocal champions of environmentalism? I mean, I struggle to wrap my head around it.
Well, and I'm not sure I got to the bottom of it, but I think it's hard to believe that these celebrities that flew to Sicily to attend a workshop put on by Google about climate change were unaware that jet travel is their single largest source of carbon emissions. It's something that is in the news media all the time. I don't believe it. And so they will purchase offsets, and you'll notice that they want to be rescuers, and they want to be given credit for everything. So they want credit for going to Sicily, for having this meeting. They want credit for having bought offsets. And they get very upset when people point out the hypocrisy and suggest that there's something else going on rather than just sheer altruism. So yeah, I think, it's conspicuous compassion, it's virtue signaling. But I would always note that, if you buy a Tesla, it's a way of being able to brag about how rich you are, but also a way to also suggest how innocent you are and how everybody else is guilty. So you get to be both rich and innocent. And that's really hard to beat, I would think, in today's moral economy, you might call it.
We have a contributor to Quillette called Rob Henderson, who's coined this term called luxury beliefs. And what he's done is he's taken Veblen's theory of conspicuous consumption and applied it to moral beliefs. So he sees people of the upper middle class sort of espousing these moral beliefs that don't cost anything for them personally, but if a lower class person or someone with less financial means were to espouse them or to live by them, they would be very costly indeed. So I wonder if environmentalism fits into that, or some aspects of environmentalism fit into that framework.
Absolutely. I think it's such a status movement. It's about establishing one's status in a new moral order. I think it's also about making oneself feel innocent within a system that you're condemning as corrupt and unfair. And so you can kind of get away with a very apocalyptic story while also suggesting that you are acting heroically. And so it's definitely a power move. I think it's also motivated by a significant amount of anxiety around what's happening in the world. Are we reverting towards nationalism? It's clear there's some amount of it that's a reaction to the end of the Cold War. And then I think, again, more recently in the reaction to the Trump presidency and Brexit. So it's a way in which I think if you can kind of engage in this language, in this apocalyptic story, it's also an effort to sort of hold on to a kind of social order that I think people view as under threat, particularly by the working classes at the ballot box.
And how much of it do you think is just driven by presentism, just the lack of basic awareness of what life was like prior to the Industrial Revolution, or what life is like in other regions in the world who have not gone through their own industrial revolutions?
You know, I think that the at least the radical left, the environmental left's presentism is selective presentism. So they will mobilize moments from the past. It's not environmentalism, but obviously the 1619 Project is very very historical. Environmentalists, by the way, are obsessed with Elizabethan England. So whenever you see a kind of picture of what it's like a big Renaissance fair, and we're all reading Shakespeare and wearing those stockings, and we're all kind of happy farmers. Yeah. So they'll pick they'll be selectively historical and selectively presentist, I would say, to fit the narrative.
Okay. And have you found it's easier to persuade those on the radical left to be less alarmist, or is it easier for you to persuade hardcore climate skeptics on the right that climate change is actually a real thing, it's a real problem that we need to address? Who have you found easier to persuade, and what accounts for that?
Yeah, I mean, by far it's the latter. I mean, my book has been mostly read on the right. It's interesting experience, but it's nice because I do hear from a lot of people who, you know, they'll kind of say, I don't really agree with you about climate change, but they agree with me on so many other issues that it's not really a question. And, you know, the U.S. Republican Party in particular knows that it needs to have a better environmental agenda and a better climate change agenda. And I think it will be creating one, particularly if Trump loses. I think it's inevitable that you'll see Republicans adopt a more pro-human, a more pro-environment agenda, and that is more accurate, we should say, about what the science says. Yeah. As than some of the stuff that you've heard around sunspots and other climate skeptical views. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. And I find it interesting that in many news media organizations, you know, if people accept money from, you know, Koch Industries or any foundations associated with fossil fuels, they're immediately demonized, and their work is dismissed as being tainted by big money, big oil money, or so on and so forth. But you identify in your book that many environmental NGOs themselves are funded by fossil fuel companies. So there's a bit of a double standard there, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a little bit of how they keep discovering that the people that were on the anti-gay crusades to sort of expose the homosexual plot, they all turned out to be gay. I think people sort of reveal themselves. So yeah, I mean, you have, look, you know, two of the biggest donors to the Democratic Party of the United States, Mike Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, are both heavily invested in natural gas and renewables, and nobody talks about it. One of them owns a whole news network, and they make they've made, over $100 million been donated to various environmental groups to advocate policies that benefit them directly. And there's a lot of it, I didn't even have room for a lot of it in the book. So it's a total double standard, and they out there persecuting basically groups that just don't really have any money at all, in comparison to the big groups. The big groups here, Claire, they each have about $100 million a year in revenue. You're talking an environmental industrial complex around $1 billion, $2 billion a year.
Yeah, and you exposed how a lot of the money from the green stimulus under the Recovery Act just went to operatives or companies who were associated with the Democrats in one way or another. Either they worked for Obama. There's all of these linkages. And it did make me quite cynical about governance in the United States, I have to say. All of those relationships that you expose.
Yeah, fortunately, it was Obama's biggest donors. They're called bundlers because they assemble big donations from multiple people, all of whom stood to benefit enormously. It was very disappointing. Obviously, I helped some people get very rich in my early career advocacy, and felt like I.
Okay. We might have lost Mike there. I'm sorry. Are you there, Mike?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So you said you made a lot of people rich. Was that one of your red pill moments in your trajectory?
Well, honestly, the big red pill moment was just that there were so many conservationists opposing industrial solar and wind projects. And then you started to look at the data, and after you stopped dismissing it, it was just shocking, the environmental impact of renewables.
Yeah.
And then I think the other one was that nuclear power is so safe. It's just, literally, here you have it's the opposite of what you were told.
Yeah.
Kind of the radical opposite.
One thing that made me think twice about environmentalism is learning that China was by far the greatest emitter of carbon emissions, and that the United States and Europe, the Western countries, have been in decline. And I was wondering, why don't environmental activists lobby their governments to lobby China to put tariffs on China to reduce their emissions? Like, why don't we ever hear about China when they're the single biggest culprit of when it comes to carbon emissions?
For me, China's in a stage of development. I have a lot of problems with China. I think it's a somewhat fascist society, or at least very authoritarian, totalitarian society. I think it is a threat to liberal democracy around the world. I think we should be more alarmed about China for military and economic reasons and political reasons. And including their influence in the Asia Pacific region, including over, Australia. But I don't think that I think the carbon emissions are mostly just a function of where they're at in their stage of development, and that as they continue to grow wealthy, they will use more natural gas and nuclear, and they will also see their carbon emissions decline. And so for the most part, I think nations do already mostly make their choices about food and energy policy domestically, and I think that's mostly a good thing. Some healthy competition is fine, but for me, the big thing that's disturbing about China is their economic and political agenda. Yeah. So
what you're saying is that countries go through a process of development, and burning a lot of coal is like an inevitable step in that process. But once they get to that point, go through that process of industrialization, then they have the luxury of relying on more dense energy sources. Would you agree with that summary?
Yeah, that's basically fair. The main thing that I would say that's changed is that natural gas has become so much more abundant and cheap. And so there's the real possibility that many poor countries can skip coal. But yeah, it's even hard for, Rwanda's looking at a nuclear plant. And while I think it'd be great for Rwanda to have a nuclear plant, I don't see it happening. It's nuclear is something that Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, obviously India, Pakistan can do a lot of nuclear, but for I would say it's even difficult to leapfrog to nuclear, even though I think that's a heck of a lot more possible than leapfrogging to solar panels.
Right. Now, you've mentioned that the hyper-focus on climate change is disproportionate and we have other problems that we need to focus on. What are some other environmental problems that we should be focusing on instead of climate change? Or as well as climate change?
Thank you. Thank you. Great question. Let me say, I'll give you a couple. One that is grossly neglected is the health of our oceans. We eat too many wild fish, and demand for wild fish is going up significantly and will continue to go up. And the only way we know how to meet that demand is with farmed fish. And so we need to have a significant expansion of farmed fish in order to keep more wild fish in the oceans and allow for sea life that depend on that fish stock to eat. And that's something we don't focus on enough. And many environmental groups have opposed fish farms, even though they've gotten much better and are really, really important for protecting wild fish species. And then the other thing I would say, it'll sound a little strange, but I think that one of the most important environmental questions is how do we help really poor countries to industrialize, particularly with clothing factories or what you might call sweatshops. And I wrote this in part, you and I were at an event last year and I spoke to some young women that felt guilty for buying clothes made in developing countries. And I said, that's not right. You should want to buy clothes made in developing countries because you're creating jobs for young women in the cities who are then able to spend money on food. And that results in agriculture becoming more intensified and protecting more natural area. And so for me, it sounds strange, but increasing manufacturing in poor countries, whether it's Ethiopia or the Congo or Indonesia or the Philippines, is really an important environmental question, and we should stop demonizing fast fashion, and we should, go into H&M and Banana Republic and buy a lot of clothes because that's creates a beneficial, virtuous cycle in poor countries.
So many of your suggestions are counterintuitive. They run contrary to all of the received conventional wisdom. Have you always been an iconoclast?
Oh, you're very kind. I was a good student, but I was obnoxious.
Yeah. You were naughty.
My mother, I would get sent out for talking back, and
yeah.
So yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. And what I want to finish on is tell me about how you've managed to convert one of the most hardcore environmentalists in Extinction Rebellion in the UK over to being pro-nuclear and coming to work with you at Environmental Progress.
Well, thank you for that question. So Zion Lights is the Europe Director of Environmental Progress. We offered her a promotion and a permanent role as Europe Director because she's been so effective in making the case for nuclear in Britain. What can I say? She's a force of nature, and I am glad to have met her, but I take no responsibility for her having changed her mind about nuclear. She was already pro-nuclear when I interviewed her.
Yeah.
And she is her own person, and I'm very excited because she's somebody who I trust so much and I respect so much that she requires very little supervision. And I think she represents for me the maturation and evolution of the pro-nuclear movement. That it's really a movement. You know, it's, for a lot of times people would just sort of give me credit for things, and now I think it's clear that there's truly people around the world that are pro-nuclear. So it's been really one of the most positive experiences of my year, has been to work with Zion Lights and to watch her really stand up to the anti-nuclear movement. But I think that, she calls our politics pro-human environmentalism. It's eco-modernism is a little bit of a mouthful for a lot of people, and I think Zion really gets it right. And so it's been incredible having her.
And last question, Michael, thanks for spending so much time with us. But last question, I saw that Oliver Stone praised your book as being one of the most important books of the time, or one of the most important books that he's ever read. Is there going to be a film in the works?
I would love to make it into a television series, but the universe wants me to write another book. So we have not been able to secure a TV deal, though I would like to still. But instead, I'm happy to announce that HarperCollins will publish a book that I'm writing on the homelessness crisis, what we call homelessness in San Francisco. But it will be a larger book about the future of the social contract, asking kind of what do we owe each other as Americans, and for a new era, I think, because I think there's some significant structural changes going on in our societies, and our politics are still stuck in the 60s and 80s, and they need to evolve. And I think Quillette's obviously been a big part of that conversation, but you see it everywhere. And so I'm eager to write this book and sort of speak to a particular problem, but also try to say something about the broader, I think, hunger for some clarification of why should America exist rather than not exist, and what is our role and our purpose in taking care of each other and being good Americans.
Well, I can't wait to read that book when you've finished it, Mike, and we'll have to have you on again to discuss that one. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been a fascinating experience for me, and I loved your book, and I highly recommend to everybody who's watching to go out and buy Apocalypse Never. Thanks again, Mike, and thanks for tuning in. Lastly, I'm really excited to announce that we'll be hosting Free Thought Live again next month, and that will be with Professor Glenn Lurie. The economist at Brown University will be joining us with host Josh Zepps. So make sure you look out for an email that will be landing in your inbox later today, where you can register straight away for Glenn Lurie. And thanks again for tuning in. Cheers.